Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks. And this week we're taking a look at my 1962 Stratocaster and asking the question, is it worth the hype? So I've actually been racking my brains now for a good few weeks in regard to what angle to take with this video. It's been near enough 5 months since I bought this guitar at auction, and near enough 5 months of daily questions in regard to where is it, can we see it yet, and is it ready? But the one thing that me and Hugh definitely agreed on prior to undertaking any of the restoration work on this guitar, that there was absolutely no need to rush it. I'm not in any desperate need of a Stratocaster, and anyone who's undertaken this type of process before will tell you mistakes are often made in haste. So we wanted to take our time because we had a kind of sneaking suspicion, I guess, that underneath all of the DIY modifications and playware, there was a great guitar waiting to be unearthed. So as the new owner of a guitar, which by many is considered to be a bit of a holy grail instrument, I feel I'm in a relatively unique situation. Not just in owning the guitar in the first place, but as someone who primarily plays Strats, I can't ever say a pre-CBS guitar was ever something that I particularly lusted after. Strange but true. I mean, late 50s Les Pauls, absolutely, but for whatever reason, I'd never played an early 60s Strat, which really had me looking at cashing in my life savings. And honestly, it was only through a bit of total dumb luck that I came to be in a position where I could pick this guitar up for considerably less than its market value. In watching videos, reading forum threads, and reading comment sections, it's abundantly clear that people have a little bit of a tendency to fetishize these instruments, which, to be honest, I find fairly strange. I've always been relatively practical, I guess, in my approach to guitars. They are tools at the end of the day, they're tools of my trade, and even with the famous guitars that I've been lucky enough to play in my days, I don't think I've ever kind of been rendered totally incapable of judging an instrument with some level of impartiality. So I've decided to make what will follow, hopefully, an unbiased, unprejudiced view of not a piece of history or a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to own this instrument, but an unbiased review of what is ultimately just a 58-year-old guitar. Now that's the question, 62 Stratocasters, are they really that good? Now, before we delve too far into my particular guitar's history, a bit of historical context and understanding in regard to what was happening at Fender in the early 1960s will be very important. 1962 is thought of as a particularly strong year for the Stratocaster, in that it's seen as the confluence of all the developmental changes that the guitar had undergone since its introduction in 1954. You had the 3-ply pickguard, but more importantly, you had the rosewood necks having been introduced in 1959. And by 1962, the neck profile had been slimmed down to an infinitely more playable profile, which really has set the benchmark of what was to follow for the next kind of 50-odd years. Couple that with the fact that 1957 and 1962 are 2 years that Fender have really honed in on when it comes to any subsequent reissues of these early Stratocasters. Again, any number of famous 1962 Strats floating around really only add to its cause, to be honest. George Harrison's Rocky, John Frusciante's number 1 Stratocaster, even the neck on Stevie Ray's number 1 Strat was taken from a 62. All of these things added up, you get the kind of perfect storm, I guess, for a guitar which in recent years really has reached dizzying new heights in its market value. So for those not familiar with my particular guitar, it's worth a quick recap. I'll link above and below to the relevant videos which go into infinitely more detail than I will now, but to quickly recap, the scenario in which I came to actually own this guitar was rather surreal, to say the least. I bought it late last year at a house estate clearance in Pontypridd, South Wales. Not a specialist auctioneer for guitars by any stretch of the imagination. And subsequently, lot number 46 was preceded by lot number 45, you don't say, a set of bottle green shower curtains that sold for £3.50. The whole situation was rather surreal, and honestly, outside of kind of eBay, I don't think I've ever actually bid on anything in my life. So it was much to my amazement, I found myself with my hand aloft with my panel being told that I was the new owner of a 1962 Stratocaster. Now Mr. Hugh Price, a name you'll be familiar with from Tone Twins, was kind enough to join me on the morning to take a closer look at the guitar and provide infinitely more detail about this instrument than I ever would have been capable of myself, to be honest. Also gave me a rough idea of what it was worth and how much it would actually cost to get it back to being fighting fit. Now, upon getting this guitar home, I didn't even plug it in. I didn't want to tarnish its kind of memory, I guess. I knew I wasn't going to probably see it for a couple of months while the restoration work was being done. I didn't want to tarnish my opinion of this guitar with a kind of less than perfect first impression. So, in the case, it went straight down Hugh's for the restoration work to begin. Obviously, a whole different bunch of issues that really needed taken care of. I mean, the considerable play wear on the neck being amongst the most obvious. It was in desperate need of a proper refret, having clearly been done, or at least half of it having been done at some point in its checkered history. Obviously, the holes in the pickguard needed addressing, and I guess the electronics needed setting back to as Leo intended. A lot of stuff really needed doing on this guitar, and as I said, I didn't want to tarnish its kind of reputation in my own mind. Any initial concerns I had in regards to having spent £1,950 on something which, at its present state, was nigh on unplayable, were very quickly allayed, however, when I uploaded the first video to YouTube and very quickly received 3 genuine offers, offering me in excess of what I paid for the guitar for the 2 original pickups alone. Now, this surprised me to say the least. I knew the guitar was relatively valuable, but honestly, the restoration process has been a head-first kind of nosedive into the quite insane prices that original bits of pre-CBS Stratocasters actually fetch. I mean, for starters, you've got £1,200 for an original nitrocelluloid guard. Obviously, mine needed potentially a replacement or fixing, which I'll get onto in a minute. But in fairness, if you can't afford an original guard, then maybe £400 for an original pot seems fairly reasonable. I mean, obviously £1,000 per pickup seems the going rate. Or maybe just £400 for a set of knobs. Honestly, this whole thing kind of blew my mind, to be honest. So, fast forward a few months, and here we are with the finished article. Now, I could kind of bluff my way through the process myself, or at least my understanding of it, my quasi-understanding of it, but who better to ask than the man himself, who, thanks to the Tone Twins channel, very quickly gathering a reputation as the ASMR guy of the guitar world. I'm going to chat with Hugh now, who's going to talk through some of the process, some of the decisions made, and ultimately how we went about restoring this guitar. I mean, first and foremost, to get it out of the way now, the work you've done on this, I've kind of referenced it a couple of different points throughout the video, but the work is just amazing. So thank you for all the time and effort, and I know you went to newfound depths to try and make sure this was sort of back to as good as it could possibly be. So yeah, thank you for that, mate.
Oh, so it was a pleasure. I just enjoyed the whole thing, basically. It's been great.
I guess that sort of makes it a bit more.
Oh, apart from the pickguard.
Yeah, oh man. Oh yeah, that was... well, we'll get to that in a minute.
Oh, and the fingerboard.
Yeah, apart from 90%.
And the electronics.
Apart from 90% of the guitar, it was great.
And the nuts. But apart from that, it was great.
So, starting at the top, I think the one thing that surprised us both was the fact that the tuning pegs, or machine heads, or whatever you want to call the tuners, were actually relatively functional.
Yeah, I mean, do you remember, we were speaking, you were out in France before the lockdown and everything, and we were chatting on the phone, and I said, I think we better look at some, alternatives, because these look a little bit ropey.
Yeah.
And you're going to play this professionally, so I think we better explore the modern alternatives here. So we're all set to go for a set of Gotos or some such. And then I did that thing, I cleaned them out, re-greased them, I got tons and tons of rubbish out of them. And then greased them up, and I remember when I first tuned up the guitar, It's like it's the most in tune, vintage Strat I've ever played, or Strat period. Actually, it just doesn't seem to go out of tune at all.
Obviously, the one kind of worry as well was that top one, obviously having split in half at some point. So.
Yeah, the tuning post. It's okay as a worker. We can work around it because if you get enough wraps on there, it seems actually really stable. But yeah, it's just sod's law, isn't it? That it just happens to be the end one.
Yeah,
because it's going to be the one that's going to be hardest to find.
Yeah.
But they are what they are.
Awesome. In regard to the kind of neck and the headstock and stuff, what did you do in terms of kind of cleaning? I know you've touched upon this again. I'll be linking into the Tone Twin stuff throughout it, but just kind of run through the process you did of cleaning it, because I remember you said you wanted to get rid of the kind of worst of it, but still leave that kind of amber kind of gorgeousness there.
Yeah, well, basically, I mean, we discussed this as we discussed every aspect of the project, but I mean, it was filthy, basically.
Yeah.
I know, as I've said in our videos, it looks great on camera, but it's actually just decades and decades of dirt and cigarette smoke residue and grease, from a domestic environment, cooking stuff and stuff that comes off players' hands. So the whole neck was just absolutely filthy. So I basically, we just cleaned it off. So I just used a product called what's it called? It's premium guitar cleaner. It's just a very, very mild abrasive. It's like the kind of stuff you'd use to polish up a car, but like way, way gentler.
Yeah.
And I just went in really, really carefully, and I just took off the worst of the dirt, and also tried to clean out the back of the neck, because when there's kind of ingrained dirt in the back of the neck, again, it looks lovely, but when you're playing and it
feels a little bit
stage
clawing.
lights
Yeah.
and your heart, your neck will just get stickier and stickier and stickier. So looking ahead, I just thought I just got to clean this out, and hopefully I've done it. But I mean, the first gig it'll tell.
I guess filming under studio lights and for prolonged periods of time, I guess that's as close as I've come to gigging so far, and it feels really just effortless, under your hand, which is, I guess, the sort of ultimate aim anyway. I think probably the most impressive part of the kind of whole restoration process is probably the fingerboard, which, I guess depending on when you asked, it was either good fun or an absolute nightmare. What? Actually,
no. Joking aside, I really did enjoy doing it. It was challenging, and when we first looked at the guitar, I said to you, "Oh, this is going to be a hell of a lot of work."
Yeah.
And I was a bit apprehensive about it, but it was actually fine. Obviously, it was filthy, but also it had been varnished.
Yeah.
And then so somebody had gone over it with varnish. There were tons of gouges in it, so a lot of the wood had been lost. And the other thing was that it had a partial refret. I can't remember if it was up to the
like
12th or the 14th.
Something like that, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, with these kind of weird brass frets, and they almost fell out of the fingerboard. And then usually when I defret a vintage Fender, if they're the original fret, you tap them out from the side. So you tap them from the bass side, and then they literally just kind of work their way out of the slot, and you end up with these perfectly clean slots, and you can refret the neck by actually tapping them in just like Fender did. But yours, they just did not want to come out at all. I think maybe they were kind of glued in.
Was that the brass varnish, or all of them? Or
no, the brass ones literally fell.
Right.
I mean, but the original Fender ones, they didn't want to come out at all. So I ended up pulling those out. So, which I hate doing, but it was going to do less damage to the fingerboard than trying to
knock them out.
Sideways. Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head that you wanted it to kind of not look like a guitar that had come out of the factory yesterday, still allude to its history and its patina and its kind of cool factor, but at the same time be playable, because it's going to be taken out, it's going to be gigged, it's going to be put through the rigors of touring, I guess. So,
well, that's why this one kind of differed from a lot of the restoration work that I do, because a lot of people who own these guitars, they don't gig them. They maybe record with them, but they don't take them out and about. And most of them aren't professional players. They're just people who've they just wanted a vintage guitar, and they've one way or another managed to find one in the end, or afford one in the end. And when you do restoration work for stuff that's kind of more kind of collector's market, the considerations are slightly different. In a sense, that this restoration was actually a little bit more interesting to me, because the goal at the end of it was for you to have a guitar that you could just take to a gig, any gig, and you could play it and it could be a reliable guitar. So I mean that kind of informs a lot of our decisions vis-a-vis, you know, fret wire, which is non-vintage fret wire.
Yeah.
And other aspects that I'm sure we're going to get onto later.
Moving down to the body, I think is going to be a sort of a big point for a lot of people, because obviously there was a big debate raging in the comment section in regard to whether I should refinish it, and if so, what colour, etc., etc. And I think both of us kind of settled on the decision relatively early on that not only would it have been doing a bit of a kind of disservice to the guitar's history, I guess, to strip it of a finish that's probably been on there for 50 years, you know, or maybe slightly less, but it just looked cool, you know. Okay, it's not an original Fender finish, or it's not an original Fender colour even, but there's just this kind of cool factor about it.
I think we came to the conclusion fairly early on, didn't we, that we actually kind of liked the colour.
Yeah.
And we loved the way that the pattern it was. I mean, you've cleaned it since I gave it back to you. I didn't clean it. You cleaned it. I thought that's a decision for you to make. But I kind of really got into the colour and I really liked it. But there was the added complication, wasn't there, that were we to have gone down the refinish route, that so much damage had been done to the body with, you know, the electronic modifications that have been made at some point in the past, then we were going to have to be, there would be no point in doing the refinish unless we actually plugged all that up, which would have meant putting in kind of fresh wood, rerouting. So it would have become a bigger job, which is all entirely doable. You know, it starts running away from it. And then you think, well, to what purpose? Because the finish looks great.
Yeah.
The guitar sounds fantastic.
It was funny,
and it's under the pickguard. Says the man who read it.
But oh man, I'm going to drop some footage into that. You've taken some grief over that, haven't you?
I have taken grief over that.
Oh
yes.
man, it's all part of the process. Speaking of, quickly before we move on, was it in the jack socket recess? You said you found some trace of another shade of red the other day.
Yeah. The finish hadn't adhered properly to the bottom of the jack socket route. So I just kind of flaked a little bit off with a screwdriver, just really, really carefully just flaked it off. And it's like archaeology, because you're going through layers, you know. And I found some red on the wood, which was a different shade. It looked a lot more like Fiesta Red to me.
So it might have been a custom colour job in the first place.
I think it was probably Fiesta Red, because they were so popular in the UK during that era that apparently Fender struggled to sell Strats that weren't red. Weren't red. And also, you know, thinking back to the auction, if you think of the other stuff that was up for offer from that particular house clearance, you know, there was a load of vintage Vox stuff, cabs and an amplifier, and also there were 2 vintage tape echoes. Yeah. You know, to me that just had like
Shad's fan.
You know, Shadow's fan written all over it. So when he decided his guitar needed a refinish, you know, he refinished it red
and took it to dye the paint up the road, I think, for the look of it.
It's really weird though. I don't think it's nitrocellulose. In fact, I know it's not nitrocellulose. And so I think it's some kind of enamel, and underneath it there's like this really, really brittle kind of grey layer of primer.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And it's quite thick. And once you start kind of having a go at it with a craft blade or something, it kind of like shatters, almost like kind of flakes off like Formica or something. It's weird stuff.
Moving on to the electronics, because obviously that was a bit of a dog's dinner, to say the least, underneath the pickguard. It's funny that, again, one of the points I make in the video is that there seems to be a kind of tendency to fetishize these guitars and everything about them to a certain extent, and I think if that is typified in anything that anyone said, is the kind of desire, well, why did you not kind of retrace the wiring that this guy had done, you know? And
well, I mean, the wiring was great, wasn't it? Because do you remember that they flipped the pickguard off when we were at the auction house? There was a crowd of us kind of all around the guitar, and it was this kind of massive kind of collective sharp intake of breath. It was like, because I think my favourite bit of the mods was the way they drilled a hole through the back of the
I've forgotten about that
into the string cavity, and there was a potentiometer wedged in there, so you could actually adjust it from the back of the guitar. That was great. And then there was the 3 switches, and then all the channels that had been kind of, well, I wouldn't say routed out, it was more kind of hacked out with a screwdriver and a hammer. Just like all those kind of mustard capacitors like hanging off the switch, and it was absolutely bizarre. But as you said, we took a lot of grief on Tone Twins videos about that, because some people thought that for historical reasons we should we should have traced the circuit out and stuff like that. I mean, I didn't, partly because I was on the clock and I was doing this for you, and we were just wiring it to standard. But secondly, I mean, just being logical about this, the idea that Dai from Up the Ronda, the man who'd attacked his 62 Strat with a screwdriver and a hammer to put all this stuff in, stumbled across the holy grail of Stratocaster modification, seemed slightly implausible to me.
If only Leo had known, Stratocaster might look very different today.
So call me jaded, but I wasn't very interested in what he'd done. When I first started looking at it, I took resistance readings from all the pickups, and the good news was that they all read in the ballpark of where you'd expect pickups of that era to be. All the wiring looked original, so we had 2 original pickups and obviously the late 70s grey bottom Fender pickup. But the problem was that the original wires had been taken out, so and just some kind of wires had just been kind of soldered across all the pickups. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. So I was concerned, because I felt that the vintage pickups, the 60s pickups in particular, were a big part of the attraction of this guitar, and the fact that they would still be working. So I sent them off to House of Tone Pickups, who's the guy who does all my pickup repairs when it's something I don't really want to tackle. And I relicked up some cloth covered wire and sent it up with the pickups for him to reattach. He called me up and he said, I'm really apprehensive about this, because the wires that have kind of wrapped around the flats of the pickups to make the contacts, wrapped around the eyelets where the wires solder in, they just been very, very badly damaged, and Matthew was concerned that he would actually destroy the pickups. Right. Okay. Put in the wires in, but at the same time, you needed a set of reliable pickups. Yeah. But he had to make one little splice on one of the wires, just because one of them did actually break. But he managed to kind of get a splice on there, and it should be good forever. Fantastic. And you got the wires in, and I'm delighted with the outcome. So yeah.
And if I ever decide to do any modifications, at least we know there's lots of excess room underneath as well. So if we ever want to stick any more mustard capacitors in, there's plenty of space.
You want me to put those 3 switches back in?
Well, that very nicely segued onto the final part of the restoration, which was, I think this was the one that probably kind of kept you up at night. I remember we spoke about it beforehand, and obviously this was kind of, in terms of aesthetic or kind of cosmetics, I guess this was the biggest part of the job. Smallest in terms of it has absolutely no effect on the tonality of the guitar or the playability, but obviously it's the kind of first thing. And I remember we spoke about looking at replacement nitrocelluloid guards, or whether we should look at repairing the holes. Obviously there was this, I decided very early on, I think, again, if anyone has any kind of criticism of this, I think I'll fully bear the weight of, I just didn't want the holes there. I didn't want there to be any holes left in the pickguard, from not only a kind of aesthetic perspective, I guess, but just, I don't want sweat going down in there or any kind of other stuff which would get underneath and likely be detrimental to the electronics, especially if they're in a relatively delicate situation in the first place. So talk through the kind of process of patching those holes and, the kind of whole sleepless nights scenario.
Yeah, well, I mean, we discussed all the options, didn't we? But I mean, these things they're just so beautiful to look at. We decided to give it a go anyway, and I probably spent more time thinking about it than I actually did working on it. Although I spent a long time working on it too. So the approach I decided to take in the end was basically to treat the repair almost like an inlay job.
Right. Okay.
Laying pearl inlay into a headstock or something like that. So I had to route around the holes that were there, and basically the complication is you have to go kind of beyond the widest point, and the sides weren't straight, they weren't square at all. So the holes ended up being slightly bigger in appearance than they were to start out with. And I used a Dremel router with an inlay cutting bit to to route down into the pickguard, just down to the kind of the bottom layer of green, because I wanted to. So through the top layer of green, through the black, and then down to the bottom layer of green. And the idea is that it would provide a ledge for the inlay piece to sit on. I glue it in, and it would be slightly proud of the surface, and then I would basically sand it flush with the surface.
Kind of flat back.
So basically, I wanted to inlay it with the correct material. I didn't have any, but my mate Dave Durnley in Cardiff, who a great guitar builder and restorer, and has taught me a lot over the years. He basically said, "Just come on down." So we went to see him, didn't we? And he had
like going to visit Gandalf or something. It's amazing.
And he basically said, well, look, he had a piece of offcut from a 1960s Jazzmaster, so it's like tortoiseshell on the outside, on the one side, but it was green on the other. So he just cut us off a massive chunk and said, "There you go, boys. That should be enough for it." And it was interesting because I mean, it wasn't a color match. Your guard, like a lot of the old guards, they're all different colours, but yours had gone that lovely kind of amberish kind of green colour that everybody kind of loves, and like nobody seems to be able to kind of replicate. And I tried everything to replicate it. I had it sitting out in the sunlight for 6 weeks, and it was hot and it was sunny, and the colour didn't shift at all. And then some people say it's the black layer underneath kind of leaching through. But once you sand one of these pickguards and you kind of get closer and closer to the black, it doesn't become a lovely kind of amberish browny green. It just becomes a really dull, flat, kind of greyish blue green. So I think both those potential explanations for the processes that make these guards acquire this patina can be debunked, really. I mean, it was a really, really tough and nerve-wracking job because you're dealing with a piece of plastic that's worth hundreds and hundreds of pounds, believe it or not. And it's like the first time I've done it, and I have mixed feelings about it. You're probably happier than I am about it, but it was never going to be invisible, and it's part and parcel of the look now. I've kind of got used to it. I'm okay with it. But I think, should I do this again in the future, I'll probably find a different way to glue it, because the black layer underneath kind of leaches up through the gaps around the patches, and then just causes it to kind of darken around the edges, which is a little bit disappointing. But, again, it's a really solid repair. It's the original pickguard's back on the guitar. There are no holes, and you've got kind of a distinctive feature.
Absolutely. Well, worst comes to worst, I'll just stick 3 initials over the over the holes. CDB. So what is it like? I mean, the first thing definitely worth reiterating about this guitar is that it was never going to win any beauty contests. And in that respect, the kind of mantra always was, when restoring it, functionality over originality. There was no point to restoring it to kind of case queen, I guess, and then having it sit on a wall or indeed in a case and not being used, even more so in light of the interesting story it had been through to get to this point. It would be a crying shame to put it out to pasture. In that respect, the intention always was to gig it, and if the world was in some semblance of normality at the moment, that would have been the case already. But I have had 1 or 2 chances to really crank it up and see how it sounds, and this seems like a particularly good point to show you those very first notes. So the first thing I noticed about this guitar, and I'm undoubtedly going to take some grief over this in the comment section, is that it seems to be working in harmony with itself. Now, I'm aware that sounds a little bit pretentious, but what I mean by that is you strike a chord or you strike even a note, and the entire thing seems to vibrate. This unnatural resonance of every part feels very much connected to the next. Now, this is a kind of weird little quirk or trait I've noticed in a lot of the very good guitars I've played over the years. This unnatural resonance and vibration, which really does seem to flow perfectly throughout the guitar, giving it a very distinct kind of tonal quality. Now, it's not to say that this is the case with every pre-CBS Strat. We've all played duds every now and then, but for whatever reason, it seems to be a very common feature in a lot of these early Gibsons and early Fenders. Maybe it was the woods they were using at the time. Maybe woods develop over the years. That is an entirely another debate in itself. But for whatever reason, this guitar does seem incredibly resonant, and you can really hear that when it's unplugged. In terms of playability, I can honestly see why some people do struggle with older Stratocasters. And in that respect, it's not as kind of quote-unquote easy to play as my Highway 1. Early Stratocasters came with what is known as a 7¼ inch radius fretboard. A little bit different to the 9½ inch radius that we know and love probably, which was introduced some point in the 1980s. What this means in essence is there is a steeper curvature to the fingerboard. This doesn't mean you can't bend on a 7¼ inch radius. It does, however, make it a little bit more difficult and something you probably have to divide a little bit more of your attention to. It's also worth mentioning, when I got the guitar back from Hughes fresh from the setup, he strung it with my preferred 10½ gauge Ernie Ball strings. I've since gone back down to 10s just to make the process of playing it a little bit easier on the fingers, at least to start off with. It's worth mentioning, however, I've not gigged in quite a while, so I imagine my fingers have probably softened up a little bit. And as I said, in terms of comparing it to the Highway 1, I've played that guitar near enough every day for however many years now. So I guess there's a very strong case to be made that it's a case of familiarity more than anything. As I said, there is no reason why you can't bend on a 7¼ This plays beautifully. You might have to concede some of your action a little bit down at the saddles, but as Paul Reed-Smith said when he was taking some flack over the 7¼ inch radius fretboard of the Silver Sky.
But you can't play solos on 7¼ inch radius, can you? But I thought Machine Gun sounded pretty good. What Dire Straits?
That was my...
What was that, Sultans of Swing?
In my
what
head.
about John Mayer solos? What about Stevie Ray solos? I mean, you
No, I
gotta
agree.
be kidding me.
But
In terms of build quality, one of the things which I've always particularly loved about a Stratocaster and a Telecaster, I guess for that matter, is that they are incredibly ergonomic. Now, what I mean by that is that it literally is one bit of wood bolted to another bit of wood. So, in theory, at the very least, there's not much that can go wrong. All of this does, I guess, is put more focus on the quality of the woods that were used. And in that respect, this guitar weighs in at 5.5 pounds, near enough identical to my Highway 1 and my Fender Ultra. So not much to kind of either write home about or criticise in that respect. I guess a lot of the finer points of the kind of build quality in regards to the wiring are long gone on this guitar, thanks to the DIY modifications that its prior owner had undertaken. But as I said, the only thing I can really comment on is the transference of the sound between the neck and the body seems particularly strong on this guitar. So it's not really much else to say. So what about the pickups? Now I know this is of particular interest to a lot of you, and as I said earlier, an unmolested original set of pre-CBS Strat pickups will set you back somewhere in the region of about £3,000. Clearly nailing that pre-CBS tone is big business, and obviously there's a reason why the whole boutique pickup industry is so incredibly buoyant at the moment. Now, as someone who has a signature set of Radioshop pickups, it could be argued that I have a slightly biased view of the efficacy of pickups, but in my defense, as I've said on numerous occasions, a good set of pickups will not save a bad guitar. They really are only as good as the guitar that they're in that respect, and as much as they fundamentally, or have the capacity to fundamentally change the guitar's tone, as I said, they won't save a bad one. But all that said, clearly pre-CBS Strat pickups are big business. So having one non-original pre-CBS Strat pickup, we think it's from the 70s, now in the bridge position on this guitar, does give a particularly good opportunity to see if there is anything special about those early pickups. Now, this is where I'm in danger of getting a little bit wishy-washy vague and using superlatives that you might use to describe an Italian sports car, but what I will say about the neck position and middle position in particular is there is a nuance that you don't get on the bridge position. There's a kind of complexity and an almost 3D character and an airiness. Airiness is a word that you see used very frequently when describing pre-CBS Strat pickups, and honestly, prior to having spent a lot of time with one, I was a little bit confused as to what that meant, but having played this now for a good while, I totally get it. This high-end and a kind of treble response, which is particularly sweet, but never gets harsh or never gets kind of ice picky. Again, to use a phrase which gets bandied around a lot with Stratocasters, there really is something special about these pickups, which I kind of feel like I'm falling down a rabbit hole saying that. I mean, would I spend £1,000 on a replacement one? Absolutely not, just for the fact that, that's a ludicrous amount of money to spend on some magnets and some wire. But also, there are any number of pickup makers out there making incredibly accurate, dead-on replicas of these early pickups. But all of that said, I kind of do like the sound of the 70s pickup. Couple that with the fact that when I'm on that position, I'm usually using it with a little bit of higher gain or maybe fuzz. There's some kind of mid-range characteristic in this particular pickup, which I do like. Yes, it doesn't sound as good as the other two, but it seems to work in conjunction of the guitar, so I'm not going to be in any kind of undue rush to whip it out. As ever though, instead of me waffling on, probably the best example to give you of how these pickups sounds is to compare it to something which you may be a little bit more familiar with. So I'm going to do a quick A/B test of this 62 and my Highway 1. So, what is the final verdict? Now, as much as people have a little bit of a tendency to get very, very annoyed by the price that some of these guitars reach, It's worth mentioning that, as with maybe a Klon Centaur or a Dumble, their price doesn't lie in their relative merits, but in their scarcity, their age, their history, their cultural importance, and ultimately what someone is willing to pay. The phrase that always springs to mind in that respect is don't hate the player, hate the game. I mean, does it have some particularly pleasing sonic qualities that I possibly prefer over any other of my Strats? Yes, maybe. Who knows? Time will tell. Would I pay £7,000-8,000 for the privilege of having one ordinarily? Absolutely not. But, I mean, that's not really relevant, to be honest. Everyone has different priorities, everyone has different perspectives, and ultimately everyone has different depth pockets as well. And the fact that some of these kind of pristine examples of these guitars fetch in excess of £40,000 kind of proves my point. Ultimately, I believe their value, or their market value, I should say now, is dictated by their historical and cultural importance more than anything else. But, that said, to draw a comparison with those late 50 Les Pauls, those 58, 59 and 60 bursts, I think this was initiated by the fact that for whatever reason, much like Gibson did in that period, Fender went through a bit of a purple patch where near enough everything they touched, or everything that came out of that factory, was particularly good. Who knows why? That's been lost in the annals of history. You can attach any number of reasons to these guitars why they are thought to be particularly good. Ultimately, it's a guitar that I'm going to use, I'm going to love, and I'm going to hit the road with as soon as is legally allowed. As ever, I'm Chris Buck. You're watching Friday Fretworks. Thank you very much for watching and bearing with me through this process. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon if you've made it this far. And I shall see you next week for probably a considerably less exciting episode of Friday Fretworks. Cheers, guys. Take care. See you soon.